I think climate change is sort of taking center stage more than ever than what we have seen in the past. From MacArthur's perspective, we in fact decided to make a major shift in 2015 when we adopted climate change to be the main area of grant making for India as such. And since 2015, we have made a fairly significant number of grants, over 70, to various civil society organizations to work on this whole issue of climate change, largely from a mitigation perspective. What came through as a fairly interesting revelation for us last year when we undertook a strategy review of the program was to say that yes, in the last 5 years between 2015 and 2020, much had changed as such. The frequency of extreme events continued to be fairly fairly high, but there were some very major positive developments in the last 5 years. We had many more civil society organizations taking up this issue of climate change. We had many more funders walking this path, and we also had a major sense of growing awareness of communities to say that we really need to do something about climate change. But one of the things that came out very strongly for us in MacArthur last year was to say that we really need to take this dialogue beyond the research institutions that we were supporting before then. So while it was important to look at think tanks and look at research which could inform policymakers and civil society organizations on ways by which India could stay on a low carbon growth path, which is what we think is necessary. We thought that, we found that it was really becoming more important to involve communities. And so today's session on, looking at intersection points of, how climate change impacts lives of people, lives of women, lives of other underprivileged underprivileged communities is something that needs much more attention. We need to throw a stronger light on this, and it's becoming increasingly clear that this is not something that can be handled by one single set of institutions. This is something that needs to be looked at by each of us, really. I know one doesn't want to put this in the same basket as a motherhood and apple pie sort of idea, but there is a role that I think which is important for each of us to pursue if we want to address the adverse impacts of climate change, which prevent further heating up of the world and consequent impacts on communities, households, and individuals as such. So keeping that in view, I think, we were very clear that we wanted to make a major pivot to look at community level engagements. And I'm happy to report that since last quarter of 2020, our grant making very clearly makes a shift to look at, supporting project ideas, which are looking at supporting communities deal with the issue of climate change in a better way, to support equitable transitions, because climate change, we strongly believe, impacts certain sections of the society much more than others. We are also trying to look at, providing support to other population groups who are going to be disproportionately impacted because of climate change. And there is also an element of, how can we prevent a scenario from occurring where we already have a problem in hand, like we have witnessed last year and this year as well, where as the panelist in the last session said, that we do have a vaccine for COVID, but for climate change and for bigger issues like this, we will not have vaccines which can solve our problems. So it's better to sort of look at addressing these issues in advance than what we actually end up doing when the problem is with us.
Meteorological climates, so to speak. And so that, of course, then takes us into this whole question of, we all know that climate change affects women disproportionately more than it does men. But that's true in everything that comes, every question that we ask about gender equality. We know that we're probably about 100 years away from closing the gender gap. Even if it comes to issues of economic development. So what does that mean when it comes to climate change, which is an equally, if not a more pressing problem than than some others? At Ford, what we have recognized in this is the importance of connecting movements, the role that a collaborative can take. So climate change has an impact on migration, on land rights, on workers' rights, on displacement, on natural resources and the flow of natural resources, on extractive industries. Now, each and every one of these aspects has an immediate impact on women's lives, livelihoods, their experience of gender-based violence, for example. So you could use the gendered lens to look at every different space. And all of these also are areas where there are active movements. There is an active land rights movement. Even in India, there's been an active land rights movement. Workers' rights, disability rights. I want to take an example because your question specifically asked about other marginalized groups. So at Ford, one of our Latin American offices actually began to look at the question of acquired disabilities and the impact that land mining and palm oil harvesting was having on people's acquired disabilities. It created an entry point into addressing the climate change issue by working with people who had developed acquired disabilities. So it was, in fact, the disability rights movement that led to the policies that would impact climate change. So I was just trying to use these two examples to highlight to you, given the complexity and the intersection of multiple structural drivers that are leading to both climate change as well as the amplified impact that it has on gender equality. Collaboratives can play a very, very important role. And we see them as playing an important role, particularly because Ford centers social justice and takes a rights-based approach, and movements then become a very important way of pushing that change. This is not to say that data is not important. This is not to say that we don't take that empirical decisions are not important, but it also is important to recognize that data is also driven by what is now still a male-led world. And so unless we have a feminist intervention, who collects the data, what kind of data gets collected, and what story it tells will leave women out. And so, I mean, so if we use the word feminism and it invites sniggers, we're probably not in the space where we ought to be if we want to be really looking at including women in this journey. And so, if we're talking about the context in India, and it's the language that needs to change, let's look at the language, but let's center women, right? In the decision. So and center women in what way? In decision making and in resource allocation. And I think here the role that collaboratives can play is in being able to network movements, so that movements then drive shifts in the decision-making process and shifts in who holds the power in what decisions get made.
When we are at a stage in our whole developmental work, is that until and unless everybody, and I just don't mean NGOs or developmental organizations, I'm meaning corporate organizations, governments, everybody, if we do not begin to look at our work from the lens of gender equality, from the lens of amplifying marginalized voices, and from the lens of climate action, we are doomed. So, I mean, the faster we actually accept this, the sooner eyes, this whole thing about eyes trying to glaze over the moment I say gender will stop. How does gender inequality actually affect all developmental issues, including climate change? And essentially, I'm not talking about just opportunities and services and infrastructures made for girls and women, but the way we essentially value and love women and girls for who they are affects all our developmental issues. And this, it stems from a very deep patriarchal beliefs that we hold very close to our hearts across the world and not just in India. Violence against women and girls, which leads to gender inequality, is one of the most pervasive human rights abuses in the whole world. And it intersects with poverty, poor education, climate change adaptation, energy and environmental burdens, economic hardships, you name it, and it has a connection to it all. So, it's perpetuated by social norms, and in India, it starts from not allowing a girl to be born, to dropping off school when she's when she attends puberty, to early marriage, and to violence of all sorts at home, but also in public spaces and in workplaces. So while achieving, we're talking about sustainable development goals a lot, it's a 10-year run up to it. So while achieving sustainable development goal number 5, which is gender equality for all, the goal that we work in, and also the underpinning goal 5.2, which is eliminating all sorts of violence against women and girls, would actually enable and accelerate progress on all SDGs. The evidence suggests that unless we end violence against women and girls globally, we won't achieve at least 11 of the 17 sustainable development goals. So that gives you a little bit of a pause and a little bit of a thought process on how to kind of frame this. As Aparna said, and she already started out saying how climate change impacts women, I'd like to focus on 2 or 3 of those aspects. One is that every extreme weather event affects women disproportionately. We've heard this, because women are already at a skewed socio-economical status. So from loss of agricultural productivity to destruction of life and property, which all stem from climate crisis, push women deeper into poverty. Even this pandemic, there's a recently released report by UN Women in September 2020, which says that, which is an insights on action on gender equality. It shows that the pandemic will push 96 million people into poverty by the end of this year, and 47 million out of them are women and girls. So, it's already kind of affecting women and girls differently. The other area is agricultural and food security and livelihood changes. How the agency of rural female farmers, and I'm sure that this panel somewhere has kind of focused on that, is in this case essential for enhancing agricultural productivity, which is very closely connected to climate change.
See, women always, all women suffer from something called time poverty, right? And the pandemic has also highlighted the whole issue of unpaid care work burden, increased care work burden, and women coming from more vulnerable sections of the society have to suffer it throughout. But climate change means that the water fetching duties means you spend more hours collecting water. LPG connections may have been given to people, but the cost of LPG is too high for most households to afford an LPG cylinder. So they continue to depend on traditional fuels. So they have to go and collect fuel wood. Forest dependent communities have to go and collect forest based whatever non-timber produce they get, and they process and they sell, and their livelihoods are intricately linked. And with these huge shifts that are happening in terms of the rain cycle and the crops getting impacted, and it all kind of then hits women, because there is now, India has become one of the hunger hotspots in the world because of pandemic, but even before the pandemic. So, and the responsibility of putting food at the table is of the woman. And again, my previous speakers have talked about, Sohini has talked this whole thing of domestic violence, the abuse that women experience. All that is so intimately linked to, you can link it with climate change actually, how climate change is making them more food insecure, is making them more livelihood insecure, is increasing their time poverty, and therefore their health is suffering. They are not getting any time to rest. So it's all kind of connected. And I think that's where any social development organization needs to put its focus. How do you kind of support women
by your interventions? And also, how do you do advocacy work with the policymakers and people who design very good policies, but they did need to get implemented properly? Something simple like the National Creche Program is so poorly funded. Even Narega sites are supposed to have creches, but we know the story there. So I think that's the role for social development organizations. So specific interventions to reduce the drudgery and the time poverty and livelihood and food insecurity, and also how do you make lives better for women, and push the policymakers to do their bits.
We are very comfortable talking about climate change as a scientific issue, something that will be solved by a technological fix. But when it comes to the enormous problems of everything, the way we live and conduct our business, I think there is a yawning gap in terms of what needs to be done. I know from my work in the network as well that the way Brazil, Indonesia, and some of the other countries who worked on deforestation have really benefited from the work of FLUA. And maybe, that's a future conversation to have on how climate philanthropy in India and the way it has looked at the movement as such in India can also expand the view to also include the social aspects of the transition, in addition to just the technological aspects or the scientific or the research aspects, the way they have been looked at right now. So for me, that's one of the things to also take away. But I will only fall weak in front of all the speakers who had spoken. So I will not try and do any wrap up, but hand over at this moment to Rohit.